It was a very different Britain that woke up this morning. Normally busy roads were hushed as most people acted on the government's new measures. In this residential area of Basingstoke, those venturing out for essentials kept their distance, but did stop to chat about what life was like under the coronavirus lockdown.
Lockdown for COVID-19 has been a wild ride, and many of us have been desperately seeking for comfort to cope with the mass psychological trauma of living through a worldwide viral pandemic. As I was browsing Netflix at the start of UK lockdown following me not having a real job anymore, two big, well-loved, well-remembered police procedurals returned to the platform to be rewatched, freshly rediscovered by those not old enough to remember how hugely hyped these shows were 15 years ago and the huge national interest in how they were going to play out, and watching all your school friends get super invested in it and working out the wider mystery, and everyone was getting into 70s and 80s culture, and I was the Robert Smith in my school and my best friend was the Mark Bolan, and we were all into like mod music.
Hello darkness, my old friend.
These shows managed to hit a rare bounty of double nostalgia, wrapping up viewers in a big fuzzy blanket of remembering the terrifying passage of time, but like, in a good way? I saw Twitter, Facebook, whatever, explode with excitement as people took the time to sit down and watch again two unique sci-fi time travel mystery police procedurals: Life on Mars and Ashes to Ashes.
My name is Sam Tyler.
My name is Alex Drake.
And even though I own both shows on DVD and have seen them both many times, I sat down and I watched them again. I had a great few days forgetting about my declining mental health and the loss of my job, and the world was in the midst of a literal pandemic.
Hello, darkness, my old...
And I was distracted from having to face and deal with the real world, until the real world demanded that we all sit up and pay attention and remember that there were other wider issues than, a pandemic. The Black Lives Matter movement are currently engaged in ongoing protests demanding that the police take more responsibility for their actions in targeting, profiling and subjecting black people to increased scrutiny and brutality. In particular, this wave of protests, because the protests never really stopped, but this wave of protests was triggered by the murder of George Floyd by a police officer, while 3 other officers looked on and did not intervene. The George Floyd protests have encouraged many to question and engage with the idea of what role the police plays in our society and the methods they use, tactics, techniques, violence, to provide civil order for the average everyday citizen. What is reasonable for the police to do? How far is too far? If officers can stand by and watch while one of their friends chokes a man slowly to death and they refuse to intervene, what does that say about how police officers are trained? What does it say about the type of people who become police officers? Why does the police attract people like this? And what does that say about the police as an institution? As a Brit, there's nothing more common than seeing other British people say, "Well, I can understand why Americans are upset, but why are people protesting here? Everything's fine in the UK. The police never do anything bad here." And that's a really silly viewpoint to have, because the UK police are just as bad as the American police. In fact, I find them to be worse because the public are so rarely told exactly what horrific things the UK police do. There have been at least 1,000 suspects who have died in British police custody over the last 30 years, and no British police officer has ever faced prosecution for any of these cases. Black and Asian Britons are more likely to face stop and search tactics used by the police. Black people are 6 times more likely. Asian people are twice as likely. While I was recording and writing this, a black MP and a black superintendent at the Met were both stopped in stop and searches, which is that doesn't make you look less racist, police. British undercover officers have routinely used their position in order to coerce women into having relationships with them even fathering children while not disclosing their real identities, and have avoided criminal conviction. The British police also declined to investigate cases involving black and Asian victims, as well as using disproportionate and deadly force against suspects of colour. Multiple inquiries have been conducted into the systemic institutionalised racism that underpins the British police, a problem that hardly seems to be getting better, as the current head of the Met Police and de facto face of the police within the UK is a woman who led a team that shot an innocent man in the head 7 times on the basis that he had Mongolian eyes. And with all of that, knowing all that, being aware of all that, I can't enjoy Life on Mars and Ashes to Ashes in the same way. The shows present brutality as a necessity to good policing, which is a, oh, cool blimey, yikes from me! And the show's writers are either unaware or just don't care about the underlying message of their show, because they're too busy showing Gene Hunt to be the epitome of their idea of cool. Which is a problem. Why does the media love cops so much? We live in a society where a huge proportion of TV shows are police procedurals. I mean, there's a couple of reasons why. They're quite cheap to make, so you have the same sets week after week, the same rolling cast, they're easily sold for syndication, they get repeated often, there's a story that gets wrapped up every week, it's a mystery, it's a simple narrative hook that drags viewers to sit and watch. The viewer wants to have that aha moment where the solution is explained and they're like, oh, that's so clever. And they want to see a bad guy get caught. The bad guy has done something wicked, a murder, a rape, a theft, and we want to see them get caught and punished by someone who, by contrast, must be a good guy. Nothing less than a hero, because, they catch the bad guys. TV coppers are public heroes. Superheroes that are ordinary people that always go that extra mile. They're always wanting to do, that little bit more. They're never going to let anything stop them from catching that criminal. It's who they are, it's in their DNA, it's how they define themselves. Maybe they drink to cope with the strain. Maybe they have a series of failed relationships. Maybe they have a deep, intense trauma that drives them. Maybe a serial killer decides that this specific cop is their personal nemesis that keeps getting in their way. Maybe there's a crusty old chief who keeps bugging them with stuff like, the budget won't allow you, McQueeg, to just burst indoors and shoot old women in the face anymore. You're crazy. You're a loose cannon. And then we cheer as the hero cop finds a way. They always find a way. They chase down that suspect they were forbidden from trying to arrest, when they find that evidence that gets the villain, when they nail the guy on a different charge just to keep him from the streets. When they threaten him with all kinds of hell that suspect's going to face in prison, when that officer loses his temper with that cowardly child molester because they just can't deal with this sick, sick world that sees the bad guys go free. And we watch, and we applaud, and we're comforted by the idea of police officers that are so committed to justice they will go that extra mile, that they just have those gut feelings about who's guilty and who's innocent that always turn out to be right. And it was all worth it because that officer just cares so much about keeping people like us safe.
Jake Bullet, cybernetic detective. I like that. That sounds like the kind of hard-living flatfoot who gets the job done by cutting corners and bucking authority. And if those pen pushers up at City Hall don't like it, well, they can park their overpaid fat asses on this mid-digit and swivel till they squeal like pigs on a honeymoon.
Congratulations, you just fell for propaganda.
On the other hand, Mr. Bullet, perhaps the Cybernautics Division is in charge of traffic control. And you just happen to have a rather silly macho name.
Copaganda shows like Law and Order SVU, Ricky Blue, The Bill, The Wire, NCIS, Hill Street Blues, Homicide: Life on the Streets, Bones, Columbo, Kojak, Hawaii Without a Trace, Cold Case, Dragnet, Miami Vice, Judy Sweeney, Taggart, From Sussex, Brooklyn Nine-Nine. Oh my god, just so damn many. There are too many damn cop shows. They're not written with the aim of making you, the viewer, love the police. The writers don't sit down in the writing room and say, time to make people blind about the reality of police brutality. But show writers do want you to care about their characters as individuals and be invested in them. Show writers want you to cheer with the cops and see them as being separate from wider criticisms of the police, because you like these characters, you don't like the other ones. Structural problems are never the focus of cop shows, because that would mean exploring those issues which, eek, not heroic, not sexy, not mass appeal, might lose them viewers on certain demographics. So instead, shows like this settle onto simple formulas of good cop and bad cop. The cast we follow automatically must be the good cops because, hey, look at those crooked cops, the racist cops, the super obvious asshole cop, those guys from Internal Affairs who keep coming back to question the main characters and get in the way of solving crime by caring about procedures, those dastardly defense lawyers who do all sorts of sneaky tricks to keep clearly guilty people out of prison. Which is to say nothing of how all the bad guys for these shows tend to be the most terrible, depraved, sexually motivated perverts that somehow the main cast keeps running into week after week. By comparison to all this, the main cast must be good cops. It doesn't matter what crimes they commit, the evidence they falsify, the threats they make to suspects. It's okay that Jake Peralta arrests people on gut instinct and then finds evidence of wrongdoing later. It's okay that Lieutenant Stabler routinely beats suspects and almost kills them. Because these cops are not the bad guys, they catch bad guys. Show writers are just looking to keep you interested to the next week. However, cop shows receive huge helping hands from the police because all of this is just one big huge benefit to the real police. The media we consume, whether you like it or not, has an impact on how we view the world and where we fit into it, and how institutions like the police fit in. Once you've fallen into the mindset of good cop, bad guys, the battle's half won on normalising extreme behaviours done by police officers that are considered to be justified in the pursuit of results. We, the public, expect our good cops to be pushing boundaries, to make those gut judgments and to never ever give up on a case. We know that good cops would never falsify evidence unless someone deserved it. They would never lie about what they get up to unless there's a good reason. They would never brutalise civilians unless they deserved it. Acts where people didn't deserve to be beaten, to be wrongly imprisoned, to be killed, well, those are all done by bad apples, those bad cops who manage to appear out of nowhere, operate without notice, and never raise their heads until it's too late. It's truly astounding how these bad apples are just there the whole time, and their fellow officers and superiors never noticed. It's always the fault of the bad apple. It's never connected to how the police allow or encourage their officers to behave. Oh God, no. Life on Mars and Ashes to Ashes at times seems to be interested in the historical context of British policing, if only to say, look at how far we've come. Remember how bad things used to be? Then the government tried to fix it, and now it's too complicated, and the criminals have all the rights. While mythologising the nature and behaviours of police brutality, it is a franchise built on the bones of a comfy, unquestioning nostalgia that sort of condemns the crimes of the past while also painting them as better, simpler times that should return. Wouldn't it all be better if the police were allowed to do whatever they wanted to those bad criminals? Hasn't the world got too complicated? This is Life on Mars and Ashes to Ashes, and how the police can have a little brutality. You know, as a treat. What's the story of Life on Mars and Ashes to Ashes? I know that some of you will already be very knowledgeable about Life on Mars universe and are ready to shout at me in the comments or send me links to your favourite slash fics. I want them all. But for those who need a reminder or have not watched the show, I'll give a however long it ends up being rundown of the two shows. For those who don't want the plot explained, skip ahead to the time code on the screen now. Go now, before I start talking and reveal all the grand and mysterious secrets. Okay, for those of us left behind wanting a catch up or who couldn't be bothered to stick their arm up, So just press the movement button as they watch in bed. Let's dig into the broad strokes of life from Miles and Ashes to Ashes. In 2006, Sam Tyler is a DCI in a place that is not London, but Manchester, mystical city of wonder in the north, and he's hunting a serial killer of women. He's hampered by social workers and guidelines and restrictions placed upon him. His frustrated second in command, Maya, decides to chase down the suspect on her own. She, predictably, gets kidnapped. Sam is left distraught as they were in a relationship on the side. Distracted, Sam steps out into the road and is run down. Not just like a little knock, like a little tap. The driver of that car had to be purposefully gunning him down and just didn't care. Anyway, Sam gets knocked out. He wakes up in the world of his childhood, 1973. It's like a whole new, it's like an alien planet. His new department is made up of WPC Annie Cartwright, a University of Trade psychology graduate who's overlooked and overworked because of misogyny, DC Chris Skelton, who is nervous and dim-witted, if willing to learn, DS Ray Carling, who is a monster with no control issues, and DCI Gene Hunt, king of the castle, the ultimate non-PC authority figure. He's a hard-smoking, hard-drinking, racist homophobe who responds to anything with violence. And a mentor figure to Sam, as Sam tries to figure out what this supposed world of 1973 means. Is he dead? In a coma? Or has he genuinely gone back in time? The world of 1973 is changed by external factors from his hospital bed, tests and trials of the doctors, voices that beckon him from the TV, radio, or by being a terrifying apparition of the test card girl. Sam appears to change the past and the present by his actions. He appears to have a dangerous gangster section for life, convinces his girlfriend's mother to give birth to Maya, and prevents his father from brutally murdering Annie in an event that Sam appears to have physically witnessed as a child. Sam faces conflict and confusion from his new colleagues when he references the future or tries out his modern police tactics. The department is not averse to beating suspects to false confessions, fabricating evidence, murdering suspects in custody, and breaking just so many laws. Eventually, Sam is faced with a key moral dilemma. Does he stick by his new friends and his mentor, or does he turn in Gene Hunt to face punishment for his actions? Frank Morgan presents bringing down Gene Hunt as providing the solution to get out of this world and Sam's only way to go home. He does get tempted by Morgan and comes back to the present day. The real world just isn't enough anymore. It's too complicated and frustrating, and Sam doesn't feel alive here, despite being out of his coma. He throws himself from the roof of the police station to go back to 1973. By going back, he's become the man he always wanted to be and found true happiness. Smash cut! We're now in London, the only other place in Britain, and Sam's case is being analysed by behavioural psychologist named D.I. Alex Drake. She's working on a book looking at police officers' long-term comas and neurological conditions. I guess. And examined and interviewed Sam Tyler before his death. It's her daughter Molly's birthday, but things go a little bit off plan when Alex is called to deal with an armed gunman who says he knows mysterious facts about the deaths of her parents. Oh, and he takes Alex hostage, and then he shoots her in the head. So now Alex is in the past of her childhood, 1981. She faces the same problems, the same faces, plus a few new ones, as Desk Sergeant Viv, here to show we're in the more diverse world of London now, and his character, that's it. And then there's WPC Shaz Granger, sweetheart, fashion icon, best character, Essex girl with plenty of depth. In the world of 1981, Alex has to confront her own trauma from the murders of her parents, failing to prevent their deaths, and learning that her father killed her mother and wanted to kill Alex as well. She must also confront the idea of what this world means. Is this a shared fantasy? Is this the real life? A different reality? Who exactly is Gene Hunt? Can Alex get back to 2008 and, not get shot in the head? In the final season, the throw-it-against-the-wall, gut-feeling, hard-drinking, suspect head-smashing status quo of Gene Hunt is questioned by the arrival of a season-long antagonist from Discipline and Complaints, DCI Jim Keats. Jim Keats is everything that Gene Hunt is not. Fastidious to the rules, strict to guidelines, and constantly insisting on procedure. The trust in the department is shattered by Keats pushing and pushing, sowing little seeds of discontent. Oh, and also because Jean shot Alex. Well, just a little bit. She was only in a deep coma for a little bit. But if Jean Hunt was so happy to shoot Alex and so unwilling to face consequences for that, then what happened to Sam Tyler?
Where in the world is
Sam Tyler?
If this is his world, where did he go? Did he accept his fate, only to grow to question the confines and the rules, and to face punishment from his closest friend, Jean Hunt? Alex can trust nothing, and nothing is entirely as it seems, right until the fabric of this reality starts to unravel entirely. Sam Tyler died when he leapt from that building, placing him in this strange world for 7 years until he wanted to move on. Alex Drake died from an infection caused by her bullet wound. Chris Skelton was gunned down as a police constable. Ray Carling killed himself. Shaz was stabbed in the gut by a car thief and left to die in the street. And Jean Hunt, the Manx Lion, he was shot on his first week on the job, buried in an unmarked grave, uncovered and unknown until 2008. The world they've all been living in is a place between our world and the next, where police officers go to work through trauma and issues. They can work to get to heaven or be tempted by the devil. Frank Morgan and Jim Keats are representations of Satan trying to tempt coppers into darkness and taking them to hell, that Sam and Alex have to fight against to get into heaven. Which, given that the show is British, is the pub.
Carlsberg don't do. But if we did, they'd probably be the best in the world.
And that's it. That's the show. You know the big secret. 10 years after the fact. So, let's talk about the wider implications of the show's universe that the writers don't seem to have been willing to want to think about. Let's talk about how heaven is a place where people are allowed to be violent bigots and the police can do whatever they feel like as long as it gets results.
fuck the police coming straight from the underground?
Don't get me wrong, I'm not taking a swing for you if you like Life on Mars and Ashes to Ashes. I mean, I enjoyed them too. The shows are funny, there's dynamic cinematography, I like the distillation of 70s and 80s culture, the character work is engaging, the soundtrack is great, then the mix of police procedural and weird surreal shit stops the show from feeling middle of the road. The shows have the elements of what I find makes the best sci-fi and speculative fiction, blending together some mundane aspect of existence with large, weird, wild ideas that question some aspect of human existence, such as how we process trauma and the question of what happens beyond this existence. I am telling you this so I don't get an endless stream of comments about how I don't understand the show by thinking through the implication of what the show's conclusion and statement of the nature of the police is in our society. Life on Mars and Ashes to Ashes promotes a highly biased view of the British police force where violence, cruelty and brutality are an appropriate and acceptable way for the police to operate to get results that keep the general public safe. Do I think the show creators intended this? No. It's most likely, simply put, that Ashley Farrow and Matthew Graham are not the kind of people who have any reason to question the motives and intentions of the police and have probably had nothing but positive interactions with them. What I think is more likely is that Graham and Farrow wanted to create a show that replicated the positive things they remembered of their childhoods, the aesthetic, their impressions of culture, the excitement of police procedurals like the Sweeney, and the quote-unquote simplicity of life 50 years ago. Looking at a recent quote given by Matthew Graham in British sci-fi magazine SFX kind of nails this idea on the head. For him, Life on Mars is about memory. It's about what you remember the past to be, what you regret about the past, what you miss about the past, and then seeing it again. Life on Mars is a show built on comforting nostalgia that doesn't seek to question the nature of the time it's set in. Ignore the rampant prejudice and violence. Do you remember when dog poo used to be white? Do you remember the test card girl? Do you remember Lucozade in glass bottles? Do you remember the royal wedding? Do you remember It's a Knockout? Remember that feeling of contentment and peace you had as a child? Because everything seemed to make sense. Because you didn't have a wider understanding of struggle, oppression, or stresses outside simple childhood things. I mean, you can absolutely sit and watch the shows for those things, you know, turn your brain right off, ignore that this cop afterlife world, what it implies about the police and how they should operate. The world that Sam and Alex end up in is a form of purgatory that is testing whether they're going to heaven or to hell. Police officers with trauma who find themselves on the boundary between life and death are sent to Gene Hunt's world, back to a time period where they had formative memories or experiences. Coppers have to finish the job and work through their issues to successfully pass on. Gene Hunt is there to help and guide them, but those who turn away from him will get tempted into hell forever. Coming into this purgatory, Sam and Alex have to make a choice between being a good cop and a bad cop. I mean, we've already discussed why the good cop, bad cop divide doesn't really work and why it's promoted so heavily as an idea. Life on Mars and Ashes to Ashes is as unwilling as any other piece of cop media to actually examine the idea of good cop and bad cop, and there's a big reason why it does not want to start pulling at that thread. In Purgatory, bad cops are cops who have become corrupt, taking bribes, working for their own self-interest, organising crimes, only not the main cast doing any of that, just those who are corrupt and not in the opening titles. Anyway, aside from the main overarching villain, the devil, many of the little villains with arcs are corrupt police officers who use their position or knowledge of the world to gain money, influence or thrills. Harry Wolf uses his insider knowledge to rob banks and build a fortune to escape to Spain. Super Matt profits from the sordidness of 1980s Soho and lets the rapists and murderers of underage teenage girls go free to build a personal fortune. And Martin Summers behaves corruptly in an attempt to try and get corruption to stop, but is also pretty happy to do whatever he wants now he's freed of the restraint of rules. Beyond these guys, there are individual officers who attempted down the pathway of putting their own needs first and have their souls consumed by the devil, such as Desk Sergeant Vic or DC Louise Gardner, those who are condemned to be beyond redemption by using the position of the law for their own selfish needs. Obviously, police corruption is bad. It is a systemic problem that riddles many police forces worldwide and causes immeasurable damage to communities that are particularly vulnerable to poor treatment by the police, such as the black community, immigrant communities, queer, disabled, or anyone deemed off by the state. Discussing how police corruption, which was particularly rife in the UK in the 70s and 80s, gives a leeway for appalling behaviour and does not address the root causes of crime or prevents victims of crime from seeing justice, is a welcome part of the show. Showing how easy it is for officers to fall into bad practice is welcome and should be discussed. However, the show keeps to the well-worn path of the good cop, bad cop divide. Bad cops are clearly shown to be in the wrong, but the main cast only has to be good by comparison. After all, they know corruption's bad. They only do a little corruption at times when they're fooled into thinking it's okay and all their actions are justified because it's in the pursuit not of their own needs but the public good. And boy, there's a lot of things that have to be justified. The show practically creaks with the weight of trying to desperately show how the main cast are totally, honestly, the good guys. They're absolutely the good guys. We just have to like them. We just like them to have to do cool things. They do cool things that are in no way they're the actions of corrupt, violent cops. Our main cast are the good guys. The show cries as we watch Sam Tyler torture a man by locking him in a meat locker, or Sam destroying evidence to have a suspect imprisoned for life.
You have nothing that ain't circumstantial or circumspect.
Sure he'd rather believe us, pal.
Well, when they hear your DI were trying to fit me up.
Mr. Crane, I think you need to take a seat somewhere quiet until the doctors have a look at you.
Hey, you can't!
Or Gene Hunt arguing that fitting up criminals is okay because they deserve it and bad people should be taken off the streets.
I'll plant a blood-stained dagger on him. I'm going to nick him for every outstanding murder in the division, including the Maple Lane poisonings of 1883.
All right, beat a confession out of him. Won't be worth the bus fare to court.
I've never fitted anyone up who hasn't deserved it.
So, even that these things happen when it comes to people dying in police custody.
He was beaten up by a nutter who should have been put away years ago. One scumbag off another. It's bad luck he did it downstairs, but these things happen.
Or that being bribed is part of the job. Or Chris Skelton shooting a suspect's toes off. or torturing people by beating them in the genitals with snooker balls, or Gene Hunt threatening to sexually assault a witness, or Alex destroying civilian property with a tank, or Gene Hunt crushing a car with a suspect inside to force him to confess, or every single thing done by Ray Carling over the course of the 2 shows.
Police coming straight from the underground.
Corrupt officers are unredeemable and must be sent to hell. They are bad. But what makes the main cast good cops who deserve eternal happiness in heaven? Look at Ray Carling. The writers appeared to know there were problems with him because they backpedaled a lot of his more unsavoury elements and made him the comic relief for Ashes to Ashes. Lots of silly things happened to make him likeable. You know, getting excited about meeting a bear puppet, getting a lip burn from a toasted sandwich, and everyone jokes that he's got a herpes sore, and apparently eating a battered and deep-fried severed penis. But his unique comic stylings more frequently come out when he says something deeply prejudiced or foul so the audience can laugh because it's not that bigotry is funny, don't you get it? It's that this is how people used to be in the old days. It's okay for him to say those awful things because he's just a bumbler that the audience is supposed to laugh at, and he's never funnier than when Ray murders a suspect in custody.
Now let's see what you've got to say for yourself.
Don't do that, please.
50 minutes later, Billy Campbell was dead.
Ended up in purgatory because he beat a teenage boy to death with his bare hands. Finds guns cool and regularly uses lethal force. Is perfectly happy with beating suspects to force them to confess. Is enthused about the idea of suspects being raped in prison. Is always just a moment away from committing horrific acts of violence. I had to stop listing them. There are just so many. He's just constantly beating people. This makes me tired. And yet, despite all of this, Ray Carling is still a good cop. Why? Ray just knows how to do things right, you know? He catches like a bunch of criminals, so that makes all of those scummy, disgusting acts of police brutality and murder okay. It's all understandable. It's all justified. It's all fine because Ray's a good cop, and cop purgatory is a place where cops go to just be cops. They're doing what needs to be done to catch the crimbins in a consequence-free environment. After all, when Ray is caught murdering someone, what punishment does he face?
Up. Detective Sergeant Ray Carling, you are hereby stripped of your rank and demoted to Detective Constable.
Being demoted, huh? It sure seems like a worthy punishment for killing a guy. No, I get it. It would be bad if Ray was killing that boy just for kicks or because he wanted to see what would happen because of corruption. The hell train would come for him for sure. Choo choo, motherfucker. If he'd done it selfishly. But it was done to protect people from criminal scum. And in the world of next to cop heaven, it's a place where cops get to do whatever they want to whoever they want, because it's what they deserve after serving the public for so many years. It's their reward. Beating up criminals is the reward cops deserve because they mostly didn't do it enough in the real world.
Ooh, baby, do you know what that's worth? Ooh, heaven.
There's a place where you're not restricted by the laws of Earth. Alex and Sam get to live in the world of their childhoods, living out the dream that the police should be allowed to do whatever they want to solve the case and catch criminals. Helping the public from scum is good, no matter what means are used to get to the ends.
Evidence can always be found to back up my instinct.
The ends, helping victims and taking criminals off the streets, are justified, so it doesn't matter if you lie, intimidate, manipulate, or commit acts of brutality. Ashley Farrow, Matthew Graham. That's the excuse used by real-life police forces to free themselves from the culpability of using the power of the state to suppress, harass and control citizens with unlimited force. It is telling that Life from Mars and Ashes to Ashes never directly chooses to confront the reality of what police brutality actually means or the people it targets, or even to consistently portray it as being bad. No. It's just the nature of things. It's the cool thing to do, and there's nothing disturbing about cop heaven being a place where officers are allowed to be unchecked and unhampered by ethics, laws, or any duty of care. It's just what they do. It's the right thing to do to stop the crimbims. Laws and guidelines that exist in the real world only get in the way of letting the police do their jobs.
Is it unethical to move for 48-hour custodial without formal charge in violent cases that may require detailed psychoanalysis?
Moving aside the growing unfortunate implication that all cops want to go to heaven to commit a little brutality with complete impunity because, cool blimey governor, yikes, we should now talk about the laws and guidelines that attempt to check and balance the unhinged violence that police officers regularly commit. Regulations, changes and police procedure within the force is portrayed as bad in the world of Life on Mars and Ashes to Ashes. Restrictions, ethics, policies and bureaucracy are routinely presented as getting in the way of genuine policing. You know, coppers just know when a criminal's a criminal. They can tell who's guilty just by looking at them.
Procedure. You're not above the law, you know, Guff. What are you on about, Tyler? I am the law.
Duties of care, safeguarding responsibilities and human rights aren't deserved by the criminal scum who are a human underclass.
You're contravening several human rights laws.
And I've told you before, human rights are for human beings.
Nothing says this more than the two overarching villains of the two shows. I mean, I say villains, but it's really only one villain, overarching in the sense that it's, you know, purgatory. You either get purified or you fall into sin, and the being tempting you to sin is the devil. So Sam Tyler and Alex Drake must face off against the unknowable and unaging ultimate source of evil in the world, the devil. The devil's evil is that the police should not be corrupt, and they should not brutalise people. In Life on Mars, whether Frank Morgan is the devil or not is a bit more ambiguous, but I'm inclined to believe it is another earlier face of what Alex interacts with, simply presented in a way to appeal most to Sam. Frank Morgan is supposedly Sam's DCI from his original police station within 1973 and spearheading an investigation into police negligence with the aim of dismantling Gene Hunt's department to replace it with another. Working with Morgan is a betrayal of Hunt and the team because it's bad that they might get punished for being morally corrupt police officers. Well, the show goes out of its way to show that Morgan is the bad choice because he's happy for the team to die in a botched operation, because otherwise the audience might be inclined to agree with Morgan that Hunt is an unsafe, negligent monster. Morgan tempts Sam out of purgatory as Sam provides proof that Gene is negligent and incompetent, but Sam finds a way to get back. Policing just doesn't feel right in the modern world with all those rules, regulations, responsibilities he has to do because he literally holds people's lives in his hands. He wants to go back to a world of kicking down doors, firing big guns and beating people. Corruption of the police force is a constant undercurrent in Ashes to Ashes. The 1980s were a particularly troublesome time for the police and they underwent rapid modernisation. It was an era where British people were much more questioning about the nature of authority. This comes to a head with the introduction of DCI Jim Keats in Series 3. Keats is brought in to investigate Gene Hunt after he, and I must stress this point, shot Alex Drake in the gut, left her in a coma for several months while legging it to hide in Spain and avoid accountability for his actions. Keats is sent by Discipline and Complaints to investigate the efficiency and efficacy of the department and, I don't know, the amount of officers shot by Gene Hunt in a given year. He is there to try and get the team to follow police guidelines like For example, having the right opinion that Gene Hunt should not have a gun, only for Hunt to get a gun, ignore any rules and do whatever he likes. Keats thinks that Chris Skelton should not be allowed to beat suspects in custody. Keats suspends a DCI pending investigation after it's revealed that said DCI didn't notice his partner was running a violent murderous protection racket. Keats thinks that police records and evidence should be properly maintained and logged for the purposes of conviction. Oh, and DCI Jim Keats is the devil, so all his actions are inherently bad, they're all designed to tempt people, he just wants to grab people to take them to hell. He's the original ACAB guy. Any of his pointing out that the police should, follow the law is bad, because he's the devil, and he's pointing out the flaws of our main characters. You can't root for the guy who criticised the characters the show wants you to sympathise with. He's automatically going to be the villain. Now, Keats is not perfect. He does plenty of bad policing, and he does devour people's souls. The usual stuff. But it's noticeable that he's positioned as being bad in comparison to Gene Hunt and the team because of his insistence that the police should work within legal duty of care guidelines. And this is the part where I start talking about the historical context of the police and public perceptions of their actions in the 1980s. Remember when I said that people were more cynical and more questioning of authority in the 80s? There are so many reasons for that. The British public had become increasingly disillusioned with public institutions and the role of government as, well, everything kind of went to shit in the 1970s and all at once. Prime Ministers were thick and fast on the ground, with Harold Wilson's Labour losing to be replaced with a weak Conservative government led by Ted Heath, who resigned after election defeat in 1974 to be replaced by Wilson again, who then resigned for James Callaghan. All very political swings and roundabouts. Also, a potential candidate for Prime Minister, Jeremy Thorpe, tried to have his ex-boyfriend assassinated. Unsurprisingly, things were also very unsettled in the wider world. Collapses in the oil market saw a worldwide recession that deeply impacted daily life in the UK. Britain was beset by power cuts that saw people work a 3-day week. Inflation spiralled out of control. Unemployment was incredibly high. Increased violence in Northern Ireland, and many unions saw mass strikes to demand better pay and conditions. Particularly notable was the 1979 Winter of Discontent, where gravediggers and binmen went on strike, so bodies and trash just kind of built up. But the worst was yet to come. Understandably, the public during this time were not too happy with a lot of aspects of public life, and especially the British police, who became embroiled in a series of cases where, shall I say with extreme euphemism, their best judgment was not at play. Let's look at some of those cases, shall we? We'll stick to a 15-year period that roughly covers the time span of the two shows, so, 1970 to 1985. I sure hope that's not a huge amount of awful, awful things. Put in place from the early 1970s, the Royal Ulster Constabulary and the British government used the 5 techniques developed by the British military for mass arrest and internment without trial of people suspected of involvement with the IRA. This process involved hooding people, keeping them in stressed positions for hours, subjecting them to noise, stopping them from sleeping, depriving them of food and drink. Police officers also waterboarded suspects, gave them electric shocks, burnt them, beat them, whipped the soles of their feet, forced objects inside their anuses, and made them do Russian roulette. Not to worry, Ted Heath, Prime Minister at the time, said that doing that was definitely illegal, and if the police wanted to do it again, they'd have to get parliamentary permission. That is not what we want to hear, Ted. 1972, trans woman Maxwell Confate is found strangled in her home and the house set on fire. The police gather up and arrest 4 local teenagers suspected of starting a series of fires in the area: 18-year-old Colin Lattimore, who had a mental age of 8, and his friends Ronnie Layton, 15, and Amit Salil, 14. Teenagers are questioned without adults present and are beaten into confessing. Despite having alibis for the night in question, they are sentenced for murder, and all charges of police violence are dismissed. After public outcry, the boys were freed, and it quickly became apparent the police had entirely ruled out the actual murderer, who had killed himself by this point, and thus never prosecuted. In 1974, Kevin Gately was marching in a counter-demonstration against the National Front, a fascist neo-Nazi group. A police cordon designed to keep the two groups of protesters apart rode in on horseback and began beating members of the crowd indiscriminately with police batons. Gately was found dead from a blow to the head from a blunt instrument, but a police inquiry found that actually Gately was responsible for his own death by being there, and the injury was just caused by a minor unnoticed accident, a fall, or apparently minor glancing blow, not a baton wielded by an officer on a horse, which is just the right height for beating in heads. Another 1974 example, this time taking place at the Windsor Free Festival. Halfway through the festival, the site was invaded by hundreds of officers, all armed with batons and truncheons, and festival goers were given 10 minutes to pack up and leave. Those that didn't move quickly enough were brutally beaten by police. In 1976, Little Towers was arrested outside the Key Club when he was dragged into the back of a police van and kept in a police station overnight. He died a month later of injuries sustained by being beaten by police officers, first during his arrest and then later in the cells. An initial inquest called his death justifiable homicide, meaning the police were okay to kill him because they felt in imminent danger of a man in handcuffs. But a second inquest returned the far more agreeable ruling of death by misadventure. Agreeable to the police, that is, as death by misadventure means a death caused by voluntary action of the deceased, as if there's anything voluntary about being thrown in the back of a police van and beaten. In 1979, Blair Peach was an anti-racist campaigner and schoolteacher attending an anti-Nazi League demonstration when he was beaten in the head by a member of the Special Patrol Group, a unit within the Metropolitan Police dedicated to combating public disorder that had a notorious reputation for beating people with baseball bats, crowbars and sledgehammers. Peach died and an investigation concluded he'd been probably killed by one of the 6 SPG officers, most likely with a truncheon specially weighted with lead. But there was no way to know who did it because the officers conspired to obstruct the investigation and prevent anyone from being charged with Peach's death. His death, in the end, was ruled as one of misadventure, the same as Little Towers. The SPG don't exist anymore, so don't worry. They're now the Territorial Support Group, who've only killed like one person on the record, but they have been called practically immune from any meaningful prosecution in any of the 5,000 complaints against their use of force, brutality and institutional racism.
Well, isn't that wizard?
In 1981 in Brixton, 4 black men died in a house fire during a house party. It was believed by the local community to have been a racially motivated attack, and the police declined to consider that possibility. Protesters marched to the Houses of Parliament, so naturally the SPG was sent out to keep things from getting too heated. The Vagrancy Act of 1824 allowed them to arrest any members of the public that were acting suspiciously. Guess the race of the people they chose to arrest and search. In April, Michael Bailey was stabbed, and as the police attempted to take him to hospital, a crowd of 200 people dragged him away in the belief it had been done by the police. In response, the police sent even more police officers into Brixton, and an already incredibly volatile situation exploded into a full-blown riot. An inquiry found that, yeah, the police are doing a huge amount of racist shit that is causing problems, but luckily, Margaret Thatcher stopped all that because she was unconvinced that racism could possibly be a factor here.
Children who need to be taught to respect traditional moral values are being taught that they have an inalienable right to be gay.
1981 in general was a year rocked by rioting across the UK as the black and Asian community felt particularly targeted by stop and search laws and Thatcher's measures to deal with inflation, leading to spiralling unemployment rates. 1983, Colin Roach died of a gunshot wound inside Stoke Newington police station. Despite not having a gun, not having any signs of having a gun, no injuries consistent of having used a shotgun to kill himself, his death was ruled a suicide. June 1984, the Battle of Orgreave. The UK's miners' strike had led to a number of confrontations between striking miners and the police, culminating in this particular incident where the police charged striking miners on horseback because they hadn't learnt anything, and they beat miners with truncheons and attacked them with police dogs. The police units were given, in the exact words of a former officer present at the battle, a licence to do what we wanted, and remove their ID numbers from their uniforms. Of what happened next, he said, "I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I was just seeing police officers attack people. These were people on the ground, and even if they weren't doing anything, just walking away, police officers had their batons and they were just hitting people." In 1985, Henry Foley, a 67-year-old man, was arrested for being drunk and disorderly. He apparently beat a police officer, and for this, Foley was forced to have his hands cuffed behind his back while Sergeant Alwyn Sawyer kicked him in the abdomen over and over and over until he burst Foley's small bowel and completely detached his left kidney. Foley died from his injuries. Sawyer offered no explanation for his actions, denied his involvement, and pled not guilty at his trial. He was given only 7 years in prison on a charge of manslaughter. In the same year, Brixton and Tottenham saw some of the worst acts of public disobedience seen in this country as the Afro-Caribbean community responded to the death of Cynthia Jarrett following an illegal police search on her house, and the permanent paralysis of Dorothy Cherry Grosse after being shot by the police while they searched her home looking for her son. I need to go out and walk in nature after all that. Excuse me. Pause the video, take a break, do something joyful just as a distraction.
Coming straight from the underground. A young nigga got it bad cause he's brown. Fuck the police. Yeah, fuck the police. Fuck the police coming straight from the underground. A young nigga got it bad cause he's brown. Fuck the police.
Ray murdered someone. Full disclosure, I went into this section knowing some of the context surrounding police violence in the 70s and 80s, but I had no idea quite how bad it was. Watching the officers on these shows just coerce confessions and beat people, I can't comprehend the ignorance and the white arrogance to depict police violence as being light-hearted, acceptable, and framed as like totally radical and cool and just the sign of a dedicated officer, and it's disgusting. Alright, back to analysing this as much as I can try. All those incidents were just the highlights of the 15-year period, and well, those are some pretty major highlights. Police procedures and attitudes towards treatment of suspects was under severe public scrutiny, and the nature of how the police operated within Britain was under massive structural change. The days where the village bobby was trusted on principle and presumed to never lie were changing. There was a perception that police officers were inherently trustworthy, so if they lied that a suspect had confessed, if they falsified evidence, or gave someone a kicking, it was thought to be worth it because, you know, the greater good, stopping crime. That the British police could not stop doing shitty illegal things eventually led to the Police and Criminal Evidence Act of 1984, PACE, name-checked in Ashes to Ashes as one of the reasons why Keats is looking to restructure Gene Hunt's department. PACE introduced codes of practice for how the police should conduct proper and legal stop and searches, lawful arrests, detention and custody, identification of suspects, investigations, and appropriate measures for interviewing detainees. The idea was to protect the rights and freedoms of the public, that's the police's words, not mine, and to avoid criminal convictions being overturned because of the police rushing to conclusions and forcing evidence to fit their theory of the crime.
Evidence can always be found to back up my instinct.
Let me say with emphasis that Ashes to Ashes presents PACE, an act designed to protect the public from corrupt officers, as being used by the literal devil to tempt officers into hell. It bears repeating. Following procedure, guidelines and conduct rules put in place because the British police kept murdering people is presented as being an unnecessary bureaucratic oversight brought in by a government more interested in checking boxes and being correct than caring about those poor police officers just trying to catch the crims. Don't you see? Police officers don't need to follow rules, do paperwork, push paper, all that shit. They need to be out in the field catching scum, and they're perfectly capable of regulating their own behaviours. You see, heroes don't need rules. Rules only get in the way of catching scum. Politicians and pencil pushers don't care about police officers. They only care about criminals, you know, stopping their feelings from being hurt, or stopping them from being beaten halfway to death, or being shot in the head. Come on, Keats, why are you trying to stop this sort of thing? God, don't you understand the job at all? He's not even a real copper. He just has the badge and doesn't actually do anything, not like Gene Hunt, catching criminals based on instinct, knowing the streets, just having a gut feeling for who's guilty that never ever backfires and never needs to be based on investigation or evidence. Take that, people wanting police oversight. This is a very strange position to take, as Ashes to Ashes takes place after the failures of the West Yorkshire police in capturing the notorious serial killer, the Yorkshire Ripper, where police officers not following procedure and relying on gut feeling let Peter Sutcliffe carry on murdering and attacking women far longer than he should have been. He was interviewed 9 times by the police. People who knew him repeatedly submitted information on him to the police, and he was arrested numerous times in red light districts for attacking sex workers, while carrying a hammer, the literal murder weapon. The police decided to build a huge incident room of paperwork that no one read and was often lost because the lead detectives decided to make their investigative decisions on their instincts. They had that copper's nous, the ability to just be able to tell what was relevant and what wasn't relevant using mystical detection senses, a systemic failure that led to the lead detectives falling for a hoax confession that meant they repeatedly refused to consider Sutcliffe a suspect as he didn't meet the supposed criminal profile. Despite, you know, all that huge amount of evidence pointing to him as the Ripper. Sutcliffe was finally apprehended by the police when he was caught with a victim in his car, and the police literally discovered his murder kit. Even then, even at this point, the police let the public down. They initially decided they were not even going to put him on trial, instead taking his claims of insanity as a way to avoid the police's actions being scrutinised or criticised on the public record. The public, as you can imagine, was not happy about this, forcing the Crown Prosecution Service to back down and completely reverse all their arguments about how he wasn't responsible for his actions, and then to try and argue that he was actually responsible. A jury found him guilty of murder on all counts, and he was sentenced to 20 concurrent sentences of life imprisonment. The Sutcliffe investigation highlights the major problems with the Gene Hunt style of policing on a structural and investigative level. It is not enough to have a nose for crime or rely on common sense or just have that gut feeling about guilt or innocence of a suspect. All those senses that Gene Hunt relies on to solve crime and is frequently told by the other characters about how that's a good thing, his instincts are right, and how the show frames him as being right. Those sorts of senses lead to massive failures in police work that allow people to avoid punishment for doing horrific things, sees victims vilified and ignored, and gives leeway to officers who get so caught up in stopping the crimbims that they fabricate, lie and manipulate evidence to pin crimes on people their guts tell them are guilty. Gene Hunt style policing is not heroic. It gets people killed. It does not actually solve crime. That the devil is a stickler for the rules and represents oversight of the police as getting in the way of solving crime is unconscionable, especially given the context of police work in the 70s and 80s. The devil is not wrong to say that Gene Hunt is a bad officer who corrupts all that he touches, because that is absolutely the case, and the fact that Keats is also a bad officer does not change that. Speaking of Gene Hunt, Gene Hunt is St. Peter in cop purgatory. His job is to shepherd the souls of officers, care for them as they work through their problems, and help them avoid the temptation of corruption or following basic guidelines for respecting human rights. Sure, maybe he does bad things sometimes, but they're always justified. Sam and Alex might criticise him, the press might not like him, but Gene's gut instinct is always correct, and he's a good guy. He's a good police officer. He's always got the best needs of victims at heart. He hates those crimbims. In the words of Philip Glenister, the actor who portrays Gene Hunt, Gene is intuitive and instinctive. So he's a good person. He's a good old pal for us all. Sam Tyler famously describes Gene Hunt as a overweight, over-the-hill, nicotine-stained, borderline alcoholic homophobe with a superiority complex and a healthy obsession with male bonding. But despite this, he's the hero. Right? In the words of Den of Geeks' retrospective of the show in 2016, if Gene Hunt seemed like a dinosaur in 2006, in 2016 he seems like the kind of character you could no longer get away with depicting in a positive light on television. But Gene Hunt remains as compelling, lovable and compulsively watchable as ever. Not because of any of the above things are untrue, but because it was clear from day one and remained clear for the rest of the series that at his heart, Gene Hunt is a committed good guy. He's rough round the edges, sure, but dedicated to taking down the villains, upholding his own version of the law and putting up his feet for a pint at the end of it. His tremendous loyalty to his team and unyielding determination to see justice done make him so much more than the sum of his parts.
Evidence can always be found to back up my instinct.
Gene Hunt is a bad person. I don't know how else to say it. I don't have any fancy words or long academic terms to say it any more critically or analytically. He is a thoroughly deplorable, terrible human being, and that Life on Mars, Ashes to Ashes centres him as the hero and guiding light of officers in trouble is deeply troubling to me. Gene Hunt has been called a national hero by The Independent, a UK newspaper, and being in the nation's hearts by transphobic dumpsterfire The Guardian that claims to also be a newspaper. But Gene Hunt is a bigot. He's racist. He hates women. He hates the disabled. Violence is his first resort. Life on Mars sort of attempts to portray this at least being maybe bad in the first season, but from that point the show's writers simply wrote him to be a hero. He drives a cool car, he shoots a big cool gun, pow pow, he spouts off insults that put people in their place and shuts them up, and he says and does all the things that some people desperately wish they could do without facing any consequences. Gene Hunt is the worst of humanity written with such relish and aplomb that he's not an anti-hero. The show frames him as the moral centre of this world, as being beyond criticism, as always being right, so much so that he decides who gets into heaven, implying that God himself approves of everything Gene Hunt personally does and says. The devil is an authoritarian who follows the rules. The vessel of God is a thug, whose every action is dictated by hatred and ignorance. I guess I should be glad that Gene Hunt is only, this bad. The show's writers, in just a stunning display of ignorance, initially wrote him as just fully using the N-word all the time and constantly dropping slurs the entire time. Having him sound like a paid-up member of the Ku Klux Klan was simply a step too far. Glad you cleared that up. Just let him use slurs against queer people, the disabled, women and Asian people. I guess none of those people really matter, so it's okay to just hear slurs about them on TV. We wanted to reflect a lot of that lazy 70s bigotry, but we also wanted Gene Hunt to operate as a real anti-hero, a man with a dark and brutal heart, but still someone you could sort of like. We believed we were taking an enormous risk with Gene. It says much about Matthew Graham and Ashley Farrow that they can write a character who is a bigot that regularly commits acts of horrific brutality and allows his subordinates to murder suspects, who is also the final decider of whether people are good or bad, and still think he's likeable. What exactly are the boundaries of likability? Can you give me a specific level of racism and violence? On a chart, can we map out the exact point where a character becomes too racist to be sympathetic? When it stops being horrific that he's beating a young man's teeth out and then it tips over to inspiring? Using slurs for South Asians is tolerable because at least Gene doesn't use the N-word, although the writers wanted him to, but what's the boundary of friendly racist before you get to unfriendly racist? Personally, I think the level of racist allowed for a character to still be likeable and admirable is none. Call me controversial, but I think there are absolutely no good racists. They are scum and should not be celebrated in our media. But Gene Hunt is celebrated by the shows he's a central figure of. He's the guy who just says it how it is. He's the guy who just does what we would all do in the same situation. He's the guy who's not afraid to kowtow to the scummy criminals and their rights. Who wouldn't batter a potential murderer to get to the truth? Who wouldn't cover up the death of a suspect to help a friend? Who wouldn't follow their guts to get the bad guy, even if that involves breaking the law? Sure, maybe those are bad things, but Gene follows his own version of the law, and he expects his cops to follow his rules because only Gene Hunt is truly dedicated to helping victims. He's the only one who can talk to them, relate to them, and bestow the ultimate sign of goodness, the Garibaldi biscuit, even though it is objectively the worst of all biscuits. Gene Hunt is the goodest of guys, the only person fit to judge and purify the souls of those trying to get to heaven. There is nothing finer than a police officer being given a world where they can do whatever they want, aided and abetted by a violent ballsack. Weren't things better back in the day, before political correctness, when coppers could just be coppers, when society wasn't so soft on criminals? It's not that the behaviours displayed by Gene Hunt were all too common in the modern police force, that officers are incompetent, hateful and compromise cases by liberal use of brutality. No, what society needs is a sheriff to put the boot into crime and just make everything into clear black and white. Caring about ethics, procedure and the causes of crime, it's just too complicated. Crime can just be stopped with a little bit of slap and a little bit of torture. And wouldn't things be so much simpler if the police were just allowed to do that? Did the writers intend to say, Gene Hunt is an archetypal brutal police officer and the world would be better if police officers behaved like this? No. I just don't think they understand the impact of the police on certain communities. I don't think they fully understood what they were writing and how they were framing him. Public reaction to Hunt was positive, so they started writing him to please fans and to do cool stuff and as this ridiculous wish fantasy that middle-aged men have about being an action hero. But all of this just makes me think of quotes from Terry Pratchett's Thud and how I think Terry Pratchett was perhaps the only person in the world to find a way to engage, discuss and present police officers with actual moral cause. And if you did it for a good reason, you'd do it for a bad one. You couldn't say, we're the good guys, and do bad guy things. Gene Hunt is supposed to be the vessel of God, the being who finds a way to guide lost and troubled souls into goodness and light. But he's a bad person. He is the baleful, the malign, the cowardly. He is a vessel of hatred, the man who does a bad thing and declares it good. More so than the actual devil. The show would have ended on much stronger ground if the twist had been that Hunt had been the agent of evil the whole time, the being who twisted those who might have otherwise done good away from their moral codes. Down to the core, Gene Hunt is a fundamentally scummy character who is not redeemed by the fact that he decides to do somewhat decent things occasionally. He does not get points for being halfway nice, like every so often. It speaks of a very real and deep ignorance that the writers decided to have a violent bigot be the unquestioned good guy they believe you can sympathise and empathise with. I don't. His words and actions are inherently violent, especially towards people like me, a violence that is never criticised within the text or framing of the show. It's okay for Gene Hunt to be an offensive brute because he's a police officer following his own standards of the law. Wow, that's just such a deeply awful thing, my god. But it's bad when other people do violence because they're criminals, they're villains, they're scum, and they're not redeemable. Why is it that Gene and those who behave like him are worthy, and those who are forced into committing crimes by circumstance are not? Why should we show sympathy and empathy to Gene when he's beating the teeth out of an escaped prisoner, but not have sympathy for the man he's beating? Are the criminals not worthy of the same attention? Are their stories less tragic? Stuck in purgatory, constantly making the worst mistake of their lives over and over? Why do they not deserve to be seen by the audience as anti-heroes, fighting back against the repressive police state. The core of Life on Mars and Ashes to Ashes is built on the audience finding a place within themselves where they understand why Alex and Sam want to stay in the world of Gene Hunt, that we see this as this liberating place where they can finally be themselves. And by finally be themselves, it means behaving like Gene Hunt believed police officers should act, the very worst and scummy behaviours that lead to appalling abuses of power. And that's good? Being a cop, an abusive, awful, violent cop, is good? We're supposed to cheer on Gene and his common sense and his role as an anti-political correctness icon. And the writers never bothered to think about how that might be perceived or even the most basic implications of what they were making. They've admitted as much, and the lack of critical reflection makes these shows a frustrating watch. It's hours and hours of grinding, endless police brutality, led by a horrific brute, where sympathy, likability and character development fall apart when you think about it for more than 5 seconds.
Pictures! You got nothing! Fuck the police coming straight from the underground!
Part of what made me want to talk about Life on Mars and Ashes to Ashes was that the creators have recently announced that they're bringing the shows back. And they're making a third one.
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
And I was initially interested, then the world exploded and I thought, oh great, another terrible decision coming straight out of 2020. Lazarus is named for another David Bowie song and will be set in the 70s, 80s and an alternative present. According to Matthew Graham on Twitter, we would never make another Mars unless we really had something to say and could push the envelope all over again. Finally, we have something. And that thing that the writers have to say? Let's refer back to August's SFX, shall we? In the interview, Matthew Graham said that the time was right to bring Gene Hunt back in response to the state of the world. I started to become aware that people were contacting me on social media saying, the world's shit, we hate Trump, we hate Boris Johnson, justice seems to be in such short supply, where's Gene Hunt when you need him? Gene would sort this out.
Pictures!
I can't imagine a worse commentary on the state of the world in 2020 than the idea that somehow Gene Hunt would be somehow opposed to how the world is right now or would try and sort anything out.
Now I'm black at a post office. This bloke had a gun and was running towards the crowd.
It wasn't a gun, though, was it? It was a stick. He was unarmed.
Jackie, what's happening?
I'm going to the loo. Reg is counting. When he gets to 50, he shoots George. Again. He was a wee kid with a wooden stick, Gene. You shot him in the back.
He was running towards the crowd. We'd been in a siege situation for hours. If he'd have been armed, he could have killed a lot of them. I had to make a decision, woman, in a second, and you nailed me for it. You turned it into a hatchet job, and I had to live that down. Looks I got from people on the street.
It was covered up. No inquiry. All the Gazette ever asked for was greater police accountability.
You also asked for my head on a plate, and that was wrong. Let me tell you for the record, I am not the villain of the piece. I'm not like Lytton, Jackie. I don't need to see myself on the front page. I don't deserve to be shown supping with the devil. Why are you here?
Matthew, do you not understand the character that you created? The character that you wrote? This violent bigot would not sort out Boris Johnson or Donald Trump. Because Gene Hunt is the type of person who created the world we live in. Men like Gene Hunt put those men in power and support their lack of contempt for human dignity, respect and individuality that the current governments in the UK and America represent and encourage. What do I want to see coming out of 2020? That men with powerful, influential platforms are bringing back a show that said, however much they did not intend it, that government procedures get in the way of justice, unrestrained bigotry is fun, and the police should be allowed to engage in whatever behaviours they think are necessary if it means the scum underclass of working people are kept in check? In heaven, All cops get to do whatever they want because in life, all those silly rules and duty of care guidelines stop them from fully unleashing their potential. I don't want to see that in 2020. I don't think any of it should have been said in 2006, and there's definitely no way to present any of that now. I try to be a smarter consumer of media, and I try to think about how it influences the way I think and the values I hold. When watching media like Life on Mars and Ashes to Ashes, your action should be to think who is being hurt by this and how you can better yourself away from what copaganda shows are trying to promote. Because I don't want any more shows that mythologise men like Gene Hunt. I don't want to see an alternative 2020 where Gene Hunt is making fun of Black Lives Matter, sexually assaults women and promotes hatred of trans people, because I already live in that world. I know men like Gene Hunt. You know men like Gene Hunt. Throw a copy of the Daily Mail with an inflammatory headline about Jeremy Corbyn into a Wetherspoons at 10 AM on a Sunday morning and you'll watch a scrum of Gene Hunt's fight over it. They voted for Brexit. They voted for Trump and Johnson. They proclaim that all lives matter while wanting the British Navy to purposely drown or shoot asylum seekers. They want capital punishment back. They defend using slurs because cancel culture wants to shut down free speech. None of them are charming actors who just wear bigotry as a costume and put it away at the end of the day. They're the men who think it's okay to use racial slurs, to hate and despise queer people, the men who grab women like me in public and not understand why I cry, men who believe petty cruelty is a joke, and above all the men who join the police to terrorise, kill and manipulate citizens with legal impunity, so long as they're just hurting very bad people and supposedly protecting those of us who are innocent for now. It's about memory. It's about what you remember the past to be, what you regret about the past, what you miss about the past, and then seeing it again. That's what Matthew Graham said about Life on Mars in that August edition of SFX. But what is Graham remembering? What is the audience regretting? Sam Tyler and Alex Drake remember their childhoods and regret that they did not appreciate them more. But they're remembering a childhood world that never existed. A fondness expressed for a version of the 70s and 80s remembered as adults after decades have passed. As a child, yeah, the idea of an officer like Gene Hunt seems like a good idea because white children don't question the role of police in their ideas. But as adults, if they were really good cops, they should reject him. But they don't. They both accept that Gene is indisputably right. And ultimately, what does that say? That we should long for a time when it was more accepted that the police could do whatever they wanted, no questions asked? That it doesn't matter how many people the police hurt, so long as some people see a form of justice? That those who are perceived to commit crimes are subhuman? That they should be humiliated, beaten, and killed? Gene Hunt's a hero, right? The one thing I can't argue with is how the show walked into an unknowing but true implication that police officers want from heaven a place where they can do whatever heinous, nasty shit they want without worrying about consequences. There are no good cops or bad cops. There are only bad cops and worse cops, and when they die, they can all go back to their childhoods and beat up nonces. You know, as a treat.
I'm having it off with Fanny Craddock. Snooker tournament. Feeding the ducks. Pictures. You got nothing!
I'm aware that I haven't covered in more detail the ongoing issue of systemic racism that is built not only into the UK police force but police forces worldwide, and how police forces disproportionately target peoples of colour with suspicion, intolerance and violence. I did not feel personally comfortable bringing in experiences that are not mine to discuss. I talked about as much as I felt that I could talk about without sounding like a dick, my own experiences with the police as a queer disabled woman, and to focus on the context of police brutality within the specific time frame of the two shows. Police brutality is an ongoing problem within the UK that has not really been a focus of wider police scrutiny for a long time. Now, there are certain peoples out there who definitely know what the boot feels like and have been trying to get their voices out, but there's a strong deference to the police in the mainstream media and they rarely adequately cover the crimes of the UK police. Since 1990, nearly 1,000 suspects have died in UK police custody, and not a single police officer has been prosecuted for these deaths. The vast majority of these deaths are of people of colour, especially black people, and honestly they involve such horrific acts of torture and violence that no person who is placed in authority should ever think to commit something like that. It's appalling, the violence that they do, and that has been unpunished. I would urge you through Inquest, the independent charity that seeks accountability and justice for state-related deaths, to join with the families of victims of police brutality as they continue to fight for justice. The officers responsible for these deaths should face prosecution for their actions, and it is unacceptable that the British state continues to protect murderers rather than face the fact that Britain and the British police are structurally and institutionally racist. Inquest is a very small charity that takes on the powers of the British government every single day, so supporting them in any way that you can makes a huge difference for all those denied their basic human dignity by the state. No justice, no peace.
Black lives have always mattered. We have always been important. We have always meant something. We have always succeeded, regardless. And now is the time.